part of tree care or trees in general, but something really important to kind of be mindful of as some of you make your way into the industry, as you're involved in the industry, and just being really good environmental stewards to our trees and the environment as a whole. So near and dear to my heart, something that's very important to me, yet I recognize that some of this will be a little bit dry. We'll try to keep it fun and try to keep the questions coming. So I think I've met a lot of you, but for those who I haven't, my name is Alison Herrell. I'm an arborologist, which is a fake word, but I'm an arborist and kind of a plant pathologist, entomologist. I help with research and development of plant healthcare products and equipment. And I do a lot of training for our arborists in the field. So my whole goal, my whole job basically revolves around keeping arboriculture a professional industry and trying to get alignment to keep us all in check and doing the best things possible for the environment and for our trees. Um, I'm an ISA certified arborist. I was in Chicago for about the last decade. So I lived in Uptown. So all you North Siders, I hear you and I know some of those trees that you were talking about. So I was a tree climber, pesticide applicator, plant healthcare applicator, and a sales arborist for care of trees in Chicago for about 6 years. Then I came over to Rainbow 2 years ago. I just moved out to the Pacific Northwest about 6 months ago. So I just moved out to Portland to kind of grow our market out here. But my background, I have a biology and chemistry degree from Valparaiso University, right in Northwest Indiana. And then my master's is in environmental science. I was in Bernie Fisher's urban forestry lab with Dr. Vogt, who you'll hear from in a few weeks at Indiana. So that's just me, that's my background. And there's me and my dog. All right, so just a quick highlight of kind of like who Rainbow is, like how I got here. Rainbow is a tree care company in Minneapolis. So they've got 3 or 4 different offices there, service a ton of residential and commercial clients in the Twin Cities. But then the entity that I work for is called Scientific Advancements, and we are only plant healthcare focused. So we run a lot of research and development trials in-house and with our industry and academic partners to develop protocols and products to get predictable results for all of our pathogen and entomological problems out there. We provide training to all of our clients, all the arborists that are out there, and there's a whole other business side of that too, which I'm not super involved with. But if you are an arborist for a company and I've worked with you, hello. But yeah, so if you have any questions about that, just let me know. But this is not a commercial for Rainbow. I just want you to know who I am and who we are. All right, so we will get into it. Integrated pest management. And I do apologize. The first chunk of these slides are a little definition-y and dry. So bear with me. So IPM, hopefully you guys have heard of this. But integrated pest management, most of this is pulled from the EPA website, these first couple of slides, and we need to be mindful. I guess I'll frame it up this way. The EPA has set all of these sort of definitions and parameters for pest problems in general. So that could be talking about tree problems and landscape and agricultural problems, but it could also be referring to like rats or mice or cockroaches in your house. So these are all kind of high level definitions and an approach to things. And then I'll dive into the tree side of things. So IPM is an environmentally friendly, common sense approach to controlling pests. IPM principles and benefits described below in the next coming slides will apply to any type of structure and landscaping, so your homes and outside. And then from the arboriculture side, IPM is a method of controlling plant pests by combining biological, cultural, mechanical, physical, and chemical means. So this is kind of my definition. I say IPM is a sustainable, science-based decision-making process that combines what we just talked about, biological, cultural, physical, chemical tools, to manage and reduce pests and pest management tools and strategies in a way that minimizes overall economic health, overall economic issues, and then health and environmental risks. Cool. So the principles of IPM. And again, this is EPA principles of IPM, and we'll dive in a little bit more after this. So the traditional pest control involves a routine application of pesticides. So that's kind of like our old school spray and pray, if you will. So if you like looked at an old school traditional pest control, it would be like spray these crops every single week. We are trying to move away from that, right? Over the last 70 years at this point, we have been trying to move away from this and come into IPM to focus on pest prevention and use pesticides as needed, only as needed. So that'll vary from site to site, but um, that depends on the threshold and things like that. But what this does is it provides more effective and environmentally sensitive approach, which I think we all can agree we are working towards. So IPM programs take advantage of all of the pest management strategies. So that does include the judicious use of pesticides. So especially now that I'm out in Oregon, this is really interesting because there's a big like no pesticide use, and that's actually like pretty unrealistic. Um, depending on what pest problems you're talking about. So like in Chicago, you guys have dealt with emerald ash borer. When you are literally at the crux, you can choose between using a chemical or losing, I forget what you guys, 158,000 trees. There's a cost benefit there, right? So you guys learned a lot about tree benefits and you're going to learn more with the iTree stuff, but that's not so cut and dry. Like saying you don't want chemicals is not so easy because if you're talking about a major canopy loss, that's not, in my opinion, I mean, in most people's opinion, they've done the cost benefit analysis. But in most situations, being mindful that there's a right way to use those chemicals for the overall greater good. That's what it comes down to for this. So preventative pesticide application is limited because then the risk of the pesticide exposure may outweigh the benefits of control, right? So especially when you're talking about there's circumstances where non-chemical methods will provide the same results, but then on the flip side, there's also going to be circumstances where it's warranted. So keeping the big picture in mind always. It's not a single pest control method, involves integrating multiple control methods based on site information, and that includes inspection, monitoring, reports. So every IPM program is designated or is designed based on the pest prevention goals and eradication needs of the situation, which will vary from site to site. Successful IPM programs will use a four-tiered implementation approach. So identify and monitor, set the action threshold, prevent, and control. Cool. All right, so identify pests and monitor the progress. So correct pest identification is required in order to determine the best practices to use, how to reduce the amount of pesticides you need, and to prevent the elimination of beneficial organisms. So when we talk about sprays and stuff, um, there's like different things that you need to take into effect, right? If you have a specific pest that's killing your tree, if there's something that you can spray to only kill that, that may be the option. There's a lot of cover sprays that will kill everything. So you need to be mindful of those overarching concerns. When monitoring for pests, you got to maintain your records, detailing your monitoring techniques, the location, and the inspection schedule. Um, record your monitoring results, and then include your recommendations. And then many monitoring techniques are available and vary according to pest. So the successful IPM programs will routinely monitor pest populations, um, and then the efficacy of prevention and control methods, and then update as needed. So update depending on what happens. So I'm going to tie this back to like a landscape. If you had a landscape that had a really bad Japanese beetle infestation or something, say all of your plants were completely defoliated, you decided that you needed to take action and treat that pest, then the next year they're gone and it's not a big deal. You wouldn't just continue to keep spraying, right? So updating your protocols depending on what is going on. And then you need to set your action threshold. So an action threshold is a pest population at which the pest presence is either a nuisance, a health hazard, or an economic threat. So this can be variable and can be different based on site. So like, and it can be different person to person. So if you're talking about, like, let's just use trees for an example. So if you've got emerald ash borer, a tree could mean something to someone different. So say Callie has an ash tree on her property and Ryan has an ash tree on his property. Callie could say, I want you to treat it because this tree, the idea of using a chemical to keep this alive is worth it. Ryan could be like, no, I just don't care about that tree enough. It doesn't provide me with enough benefits, right? So that's where the economic threat can be a little bit variable. But on a large scale, it's pretty obvious, right? Like if you're talking about millions of dollars that would be required for tree removal and losing all of the carbon sequestration, air filtration, yada, 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 and also not having the manpower to even do all of those removals, these are those things that we're constantly weighing out when we're setting those action thresholds. It's critical to guiding the pest control decisions, and a defined threshold will focus size, scope, and intensity of IPM plan. And I will tie this back one more time, just quickly. Uh, if any of you guys have ever had like aphids or a magnolia scale on your property, things that create like honeydew that are dripping, if you've got it right over your, say, your patio, so right, especially during COVID, our patios are super, super important to us. If you've got honeydew dripping down on you and it's gross and it's causing a bunch of sooty mold and all of these bees are coming on, you're going to be more willing to decide to use, that's going to give you the opportunity to use a pesticide in order to get rid of that problem so you have usable space versus if it were just like a random tree in the corner of the back of your yard, right? So could be the same pest but a totally different situation, and that's the whole overarching theme of this talk, I guess. All right, so IPM focuses on prevention by removing conditions that attract pests, such as food, water, and shelter. So this is kind of more like in your building circumstance. If you have cockroaches, take out your garbage, right? So I'll skip to that bottom part. Preventative actions for household pests could be reducing clutter, sealing areas. If you've ever had a mouse, seal it up. Removing your trash, maintaining clean areas. If you need pest barriers, removing standing water, stuff like that. If you guys are in any big apartment buildings in Chicago, occasionally you'll see like verbiage up talking about things that you can do to educate your occupants of your building, and that's all a part of IPM. And then just to jump back, preventative actions for tree pests would be more of like cultural practices, so a little bit different, um, but like proper watering, proper mulching, pruning, um, reducing soil compaction, reducing girdling roots, using the correct fertilizers, maybe using plant growth regulators. So lots of things besides just the actual chemicals. And then the last step is that controlling of the pests. So control methods, trapping, heat and cold treatment, physical removal. And this applies for both trees and inside your home. So, like if you had bagworms, one of the biological or one of the cultural ways to get rid of them is to just cut them off your tree. Sometimes that doesn't, it's not always possible, but that is possible in some circumstances. And then pesticide application, and then in some cases, biological control. Um, and the pest control is required if action thresholds are exceeded. So if you've set that threshold and this is above that, it's not acceptable, that's where you need to bring in the IPM programs to consider the risk for the applicant, building occupants, and environment. And as I get into the tree side of things, I'll talk about this a little bit more, but each type of chemical application carries different risk and different public perception. So like we'll get into it, but like we've got sprays, right? That's like you're spraying stuff, there's a lot of drift. Maybe it's not as harmful of a chemical, but right, you got to weigh that out versus a trunk injection, which goes directly into the tree. So there's no drift, there's no other person that could potentially get harmed by it. However, it's a little bit more risk to the applicator because that's on them, and potentially with like a restricted use pesticide or something that's actually quite a bit higher of a risk for the applicator only, but it's still something that you always need to be weighing and considering. And also part of the reason that I do what I do with my job to try to get safer chemicals and chemical applications out there. Um, so yeah, always something that I'm thinking about. And if you guys have any like thoughts or ideas, please feel free to let me know. All right, so benefits of integrated pest management, obviously, reduces the number of pests, reduces the number of pesticide applications, and will save money while protecting human health. So um, this kind of ties back to what I was just talking about, getting safer application methods out there, right? So trying to protect human health as much as possible. But then I think with the EPA put this out, they were really specifically talking about how like cockroaches and mice and other rodents actually have been tied to pretty gross living situations that have increased a lot of like asthma issues and cardiovascular issues with tenants of those areas. So I think that was where that kind of came from. But certainly always protecting human health. All right. So IPM means using a toolbox approach. Um, really got to beat that one in. So diagnose your problems properly, review your cultural and chemical options, and determine your best application technique given the pest, pathogen, and site. All right. So how this ties in, plant healthcare. So plant healthcare is we use IPM for plant healthcare, but plant healthcare is kind of like the broad term that we use in arboriculture to talk about any treatments that are done to a tree. So I'll back up really quick. If you have an arborist come to your property, and shout out to my certified arborist here, you go out, you have the ability to identify the tree, see what the circumstance is. You can evaluate and see if it needs pruning, maybe it has broken branches, maybe it needs to be removed because it has, some sort of it's whatever had some sort of injury and has a bunch of decay, whatever. So you're able to evaluate those things. But then the number one thing that you're typically getting calls for is like, my tree looks sick. So utilizing your skills as a diagnostician to see what's going on with the tree, and we'll have a few little pictures that we can maybe get some shout outs during as we move along. Um, is really important to determine what recommendations you can make. So then you show up and maybe you see the tree, maybe it has like a needle cast. And in that circumstance, you can tell your client, we have an option for like a foliar application spray. We'd have to do 3 sprays at the beginning of the year. Um, and maybe Mrs. Smith is like, yes, please do it. I want these trees to look as good as possible. They're really important to me for shading or because they block my neighbor's yard and he walks around naked all the time, whatever the case may be. Then you would, potentially decide that that's what you want to use plant health care for. Or they could say, no, it doesn't matter. And that's where you would determine, that's where you're setting that threshold where they're okay with a tree that declines over time. They're happy to have nature take its course. The trees will live as long as they live. And then when they need to come out, they need to come out. So plant health care is a comprehensive program for managing the health, appearance, structure, and vitality of plants in the landscape. All of these occurring within the expectations that are set with the clients. And then the other important thing that I did not mention is this is also keeping their budgets in mind. So sometimes if you show up on a property, like nothing is free, right? None of these treatments are free, unfortunately, especially if you're already calling an arborist to consult and give you information. Like usually it's out of your hands by that point. It's not like your ficus that you can just like spray with neem oil or something. So you get out there and you're like, okay, this is sick, this is sick, this is what we can do, this is what we can do. Sometimes clients will say, do it all, great, the sky is the limit. But sometimes they'll say, no, I don't want that many chemicals on my property, or I don't really care about the chemicals, but I can't afford that. So always weighing your options, talking about those different thresholds for each individual tree as well. And then every client will have a different acceptable threshold for each pest. And I think the perfect example is like what I said with aphids or scale. If it's on your patio, you're going to want to deal with it. If it's in the corner of your yard, you might not care. All right, so this is just another slide. Comprehensive program to manage the health, structure, and appearance of plants in the landscape. All right, so I would be remiss to not discuss safety always, always. And I know you guys don't really necessarily deal with this hands-on, but PPE and safety is extremely important industry-wide. When you're talking about any sort of chemical applications, even for you guys that have just like homeowner applications that you can get at Home Depot, please read the label, make sure you're being safe. The last thing you want to do is accidentally ingest chemicals or expose yourself to something dangerous. So typically PPE and safety for a pesticide applicator will include, chemicals that you actually need an applicator license for would be pants, long sleeves, chemical resistant gloves, shoes and socks, and safety glasses. And then there are also quite a few other things that are sometimes on the labels for other things. So sometimes hard hats, face shield, apron, respirators, rubber boots, reflective vests or high vis, and cones. That's more for a traffic um, circumstance. And then sometimes even like a Tyvek suit. So being really mindful of these, making sure that we're being as safe as possible. If you were with me last time, you got to see this cool picture of me. Um, Read the label. The label is the law. I just pulled up a couple of examples of a couple of our products, and you can see it outlined right there, right? Long sleeves, long pants, chemical resistant gloves, shoes and socks, eyewear. So please, 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 if you are using anything, follow these. All right, so why do we care about IPM? Why do we care about plant healthcare? So I think it's clear, but basically, pests, diseases, and abiotic disorders can alter the morphology or physiological process in which a tree um, long-term plant health and can negatively affect or um, plant aesthetics are affected long-term. So could be a one-time catastrophic event that would be like an acute problem, and then chronic would be like a long-term progressive problem. So um, acute could be, ooh, I mean that in this circumstance could even just be like storm damage if a limb came down. So that would be not that would be abiotic, right? Um, and then long term could also be abiotic, like something like really poor soil quality, but then it could also be like a pest, like emerald ash borer that comes in and slowly declines it over time. All right, so how do diseases affect plants? So hang on, I need to move your faces around a little bit. Okay, so fungi are the number one disease causing organism in plants. I'm not going to get too deep into into the weeds here with life cycles and things, but basically, uh, funguses can cause a ton of tree problems. If you want to read about the hyphae development, you can. I'll leave the screen up for just a moment. Okay, cool. So like we said, fungus is the number one disease causing organism in plants. They can cause things like leaf spot or needle casts. They can also cause galls and cankers. And these can range from being aesthetic to life threatening. And then they can also cause things like root rot and vascular wilts. And again, like root rots can be minor and be slow over time. Vascular wilts can literally kill a tree within weeks in some circumstances, days in some circumstances. So the severity of fungal pathogens varies, and we'll kind of get into that in a little bit later. Bacteria, there's not a ton of bacteria that impact trees, but they negatively impact trees by feeding on the amino acids, which are necessary for protein synthesis. So one of the big ones that we see um, would be fire blight. Um, that one impacts like pears and things in the Chicagoland area. And that is actually a bacteria, not a fungi, which a lot of people don't know. So that's also important thing to note. You got to get that diagnosis right in order to get the treatment correct, right? Because if you're going to see if it's a bacteria, but you mistook it for a fungi and you treat it with fungicide, it's not going to do anything. There are also things like viruses and mycoplasm-like organisms. The obligate parasites attack the plant cells, and that can cause deformed growth, witch's brooms, yellow's diseases, things like that. And then this picture, I apologize, I just noticed this, but nematodes, those are microscopic worm-like organisms that grow inside the tree's water conducting tissue, essentially girdling the tree. So I don't know what happened to the bottom of this, but you can see that those trees just totally died and turned brown because their vascular tissue is plugged up. Okay, so how do arthropods, so insects, affect plants? Some do nothing, but in some circumstances, we've got a few different kind of like groups of arthropods. So piercing and sucking insects, so they passive feed on the vascular system. And they feed within those plant cells. So things would be like armored scales and spider mites. And you can see like that stippling happening right on the leaves. And you can see that very obviously in the picture. The second one, we've got boring insects. So that'd be like our emerald ash borer, our ambrosia beetles, things like that. They bore into the tree. And then in this circumstance with EAB, they feed larval galleries through the cambium of the tree. Then you've got your chewing pests. So that would be like a Japanese beetle. They pop on your leaves, chew them up. You can see that they skeletonize those branches or those leaves. And then we also have galls, and those can be variable. Some cause problems and some really don't. But you can see that the formation of the tissue around those galls can be pretty aesthetically concerning. All right, so important thing to note, and this goes back to our overarching IPM ordeal. Most landscape pests are issues are usually due to another fundamental issue. Not always, like so in the example of Asian longhorn beetle or emerald ash borer or spotted lanternfly, some of our invasive pests, typically those just go for healthy trees, and that has nothing to do with the underlying issues. But in most circumstances, pests are a secondary issue. And some of the fundamental problems that you can see would be like soil chemistry or soil structure. So you've got like really clay soils, soils that are nutrient deficient, compacted, or have like poor pH, either way too low or way too high. And we see this in urban environments literally all the time, right? So like you move into a house and you find you're trying to plant some hostas or something, and you find that it's literally just like rubble in your yard. Even though they planted a bunch of nice trees, that soil is total crap. And then we also come to the sites where they've actually been like rolled over by really heavy equipment, and it's just so compacted. Yet there we have planted all of these trees in the middle of these parking lots. So then those trees become more susceptible to pest issues because they are not happy. And then mechanical damage is another one that can be from equipment going through and ripping things up. So good old Chicago, always changing up sidewalks, redoing the sewer systems, ripping things up without any notice. So that certainly is a concern. And then additionally, like the landscape kind of services, like weed whips and other things can go through, damage the trunk of the tree, and that can allow a pathogen to come in that way. And I've also seen that with like things that are more extreme, like a car accident, like if a car smashes into a tree and then causes damage, then that's a way for those pests and pathogens to come in. More issues, surprise, surprise, inappropriate planting sites, bad planting practices. So we've got great photos here, right? Um, I can't tell you how many trees have been either telephone poled and planted way too deep, or in the bottom right photo, volcano mulched. Yay, our favorite. And then, I mean, the picture in the middle is just hilarious. Talk about an inappropriate planting site. Like the cutouts that we plant things in are comically bad. But anyway, you're basically just maybe it's fine that you have a tree there, but you're basically just asking that tree to have a shortened lifetime and to have a pest or a pathogen come in and attack it because it's sad. Also, environmental injury. So, too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. And actually, this kind of goes back to that discussion around yellow woods, which I actually think yellow woods will be appropriate for Chicago soon, unfortunately, with climate change. But historically speaking, that's not it. Chicago wasn't quite the right habitat. Climate wise for yellow woods. So these are just things that are not necessarily even our fault, but things that are just kind of like looming always. Yay for urban trees. All right, and then this is where it kind of comes in like the 1-2 punch. Ambrosia beetles, particularly, this is just an example, are attracted specifically to stressed trees. And then they come in, they start to feed, and then the ambrosia fungus gets in the vascular tissue of the trees and then slowly plugs it up and slowly kills those trees. So and it's not just ambrosia beetles, it's things like bronze birch borer come in. We got a ton of birch trees in Chicago. They look sad a lot of times because the soil is wrong. There's an iron deficiency. They look chlorotic, and then it's like that cycle, which I don't think I have a slide on that, unfortunately, but it's kind of like that spiral of decline. So All right. So, methods of plant health care and appropriate response process. So, this is exactly what we talked about with the big EPA broad definitions, but this kind of hones it in. Um, Set action thresholds. We monitor, diagnose, prevention, and then we talk about control. So set those action thresholds. So at a point at which the pest populations or environmental indication conditions indicate that pest control must be taken. So citing a single pest does not always mean control is needed. Set by client and the arborist, right? So this is a little bit blurry, but you can see if you had like a feeding insect on your leaves, if it was the top left, not really a big deal. But if you get to the bottom right, like, a, it looks really bad. So from an aesthetic standpoint, it could be reason enough to treat. But B, if you're removing the photosynthesizing material of a plant at that high of a rate year after year, it's gonna die, right? So these are the things. And then I think there's just a photo of like a small infestation versus a large infestation. So depending on the pest, depending on um, the site, would you treat on the left? Probably not, but on the right, looking problematic. So monitoring. So this is where the whole like inspect and treat kind of mentality comes into play. Like I said, the old school way was sort of like spray and pray. And unfortunately have like actually I have dealt with quite a few people who still kind of fall into that category. They're like the old school arborists and they whatever. They don't want to change their ways. So we can get past that. It's helpful. So if you monitor for pests, identify them accurately, and then make the appropriate control decisions in conjunction with that action threshold. So monitoring, identifying removes the possibilities that pesticides would be used when they are not needed or that the wrong pesticide would be used. And so ideally you want to set up schedule for monitoring of landscapes with professional folks if you can. Monitor, gather information. So the site information, these are all like this is a red flag if you call an arborist out and you want to talk about pest stuff and they don't go through an actual like discussion about your property, you might want to call someone else. So site information, like you should be talking about like what the irrigation on the property is like, what have you treated for before, when was the landscape established, identify key plants like so as a homeowner, I don't know, I in my yard specifically can think of a couple trees that I really love and a couple like shrubs that I really don't care about, right? So identifying which ones are important. And then also because there are a lot of common pest problems and a lot of common cultural problems. Um, and sometimes you just need to make the decision like, I can't tell you how many times I've showed up on a property where there's like 1,000 boxwoods and they all have like 5 different boxwood problems that we know are common problems. And it's like, okay, well, that actually may be a circumstance where you just talk about redoing things rather than spray them with a million different things to try to get those under control. And then also like this goes back to right tree, right place, right plant, right place. Um, Key pests likely tied to key plants. So those are things that we all I want to identify and then record observation um, and then come up with your plan. So things that you may need to monitor things. So hand lenses can be really good for some pathogen and pest problems. You sometimes actually need to be able to see the plant. Binoculars, if you're talking about something that's really high up in the tree and maybe you see tip dieback or something and it's hard for you to notice from the ground. Mallets are great tools to sound out and see if there are anything going on with the base of the tree, any defects that you can't necessarily see but you could hear. Um, Pole pruner or hand pruners can be helpful, especially if you're suspecting like wilts or something. You can cut things and peel bark back, and that can help to be identifying. Trowels, so if you know that there's like a soil or a root issue, to dig out around the base of the tree can be great. And then any sort of sample bag. So a lot of times for trees that have issues, it's a soil problem. So sending in soil samples is needed. Or even diagnostic stuff is needed. And it's okay if an arborist doesn't know things, but just to find the answer for you is like a really helpful tool that any good arborist should be able to provide you with. I mean, I deal with diagnostics every day and I still don't, right? I still don't know all the plant things. And a lot of times it can be a variety of things that show up certain ways. And again, finding the root cause of those things to actually treat appropriately is going to be important. All right. So I won't go too much into the weeds with this, but growing degree days and phenology. So this comes in with monitoring. So growing degree days are a measurement of heat accumulation, and they're used by like farmers, arborists, horticulturists, gardeners to predict plant and animal development rates, like when something will bloom or when something will reach maturity. And as our climate has been wonky year after year, this has been something really important that we use. And the reason this is important a lot of times is for the timing of treatments, because in plant healthcare, typically you would be treating for a specific pest at the peak of their emergence. It depends on the biology, but I'm just thinking, like, for example, scale. You would want you want to be making sure that you treat at the peak of their crawler emergence, or you're not going to have success with treatments at that point. You just be spraying chemicals for no reason. So this is a great opportunity to track, a great way to track. If anybody has specific questions on this, please let me know. There are some like calculators and stuff out there, but basically it's the average high and low temp divided by 2, right? So average of the high and low temp of the day minus 50 degrees is there you go, the calculation to find that. It's not super important if you're not actually doing treatments, but it is important for you to recognize that this exists. And then I was going to say phenology, hopefully it's on the next slide. Yes. Um, the study of periodic plant and animal life cycle events and how they're influenced by seasonal variations in climate, as well as habitat and elevation. And so like we've got smoke bush here, and some things would be like, you'll even see, it'll be in the recommendation, like treat 1 week after forsythia bloom or whatever. So that's what we mean when we say phenology. Okay, so diagnostics, let's get into this. So friend, foe, or whatever. So on the left, we've got a whitefly. Those are actually our friends. Those are our kind of predatory whiteflies, and they can actually eat some of our problematic like mite species and things. In the middle, we've got a Japanese beetle. Those are pretty foe-ish in high populations because they will annihilate your plants. And then on the right, I just put a centipede wasp gall, which I consider these to be kind of whatever, but, because they don't actually harm your plant, but they look really icky. So I just thought it was an interesting thing to include. And these are what you're going to be kind of considering as you're doing your diagnostics. Okay, so I don't know if we can play this as a little game, if any of you guys know the answers. But basically, diagnostics, I'm going to do 2 slides that are just like knowing the pest, like what's normal, what's not. Does anybody know what's wrong with this plant? No. Okay, cool. No
Wait,
worries.
isn't
Go ahead.
something eating it? Those look like 2 larvae right there, like a yellow and an orange one.
Yep, those are larvae. This is a boxwood, and these are boxwood leaf miner. And these are super common on our boxwoods in Chicago. But then I will note really quick that boxwoods are also pretty notorious for getting other issues. So winter damage can be confused with leaf miner. Boxwood leaf blight can be confused with leaf miner. So that's where knowing the pests and knowing your plants, just learning. There's nothing that replaces experience, but there are certainly lots and lots of places to learn. Thanks for playing. I don't know who that was, but all right, know the pest, what's normal, what's not. First glance, you might not notice that there's anything wrong with this, but does anybody know this guy?
It's a gall. It's a bullet gall.
This is a scale. This is Lecanium scale. So these are on the twigs. I forget which species of tree this is, but these are a lot of places also in Chicagoland. Typically, you'll see them on like smaller oaks. But again, right, like if you're just looking at the branches of the tree, you might not even notice because that's super zoomed in. You're just walking by and you just see brown, you just see the twig and it's brown and it has a bunch of leaves. You wouldn't even potentially notice this. But over time, this scale will actually really, really suck all of the nutrients out of that plant, and it'll start to look pretty bad pretty quick. Okay. Do we know this guy, this pathogen?
It's also a gall, like a hawthorn, juniper gall or something like that.
Yeah, so in correct, the stage that I'm showing in this photo is quince rust. So on hawthorn, it shows up as these little rusts on the berries, but then correct, it's the same pathogen that shows up on the juniper as those bigger galls. And I call this the Cheeto dust pathogen. This is a fungi though. This is a fungus. And if you see these, you'll come up to a hawthorn and you'll see all of these little orange little finger like things on the berries, and you're like, and then you'll usually see there's like leaf spots, so it looks kind of like a sad tree. But then if you touch it or tap it, it's your fingers will be covered in orange. Like it's literally like Cheeto dust, like if you had eaten a lot of Cheetos. It's crazy. But keep an eyeball out for these things because they're super common and really interesting. Okay, and then last one. So this is a really zoomed in picture. um any guesses? Cool. So this is Dothostroma needle cast. So this is interesting too because there's a ton of different needle blights, needle casts out there. This one you can tell because it's got banding around it. See where it turns from green to brown and there's like that banding area. That's the distinguishing factor on this, in addition to those little black um, fruiting bodies. But then there are also other needle casts out there that impact like the second year needles or the first year needles. So it's a fun game to learn all of the different pests and pathogens out there. But um, you know, we just had a couple of good guesses on things that we see out there on a day-to-day basis, and it's not wrong to not know. And a lot of things look really similar. So Thanks for thanks for playing with me on that. So then we'll get into prevention. So how can we intervene? Um, this is what we call the disease triangle. So you have your host, your pathogen, your environment, and then disease, and then time, of course. So what can you do? So host, how can you change or modify the host? Can you change or modify the environment? And can you change or modify the pathogen? I'm sticking this slide in really quick. Prevention, general cultural prevention. Proper watering, proper pruning, proper mulching, reducing soil compaction and girdling roots. You can use an air tool, prescription fertilizers as needed, and plant growth regulators if warranted. So back to the prevention, changing the host. So this is an example of the photo is an example of issues that we come across with utilities. You guys have seen trees that have just been like chopped in like the saddest, most irresponsible ways, but a lot of times it's in the name of safety for utilities. Which now that I live in wildfire land, this is even more important than I recognized. But those butchered trees look really bad, but a tree touching a transformer or a primary wire that could cause a major fire is obviously way more important to keep that tree away than it is to keep the tree looking nice. But what you could do to prevent is change the host. So again, right tree, right place. Plant a bush under the under the power line or a small tree instead of a gigantic one. Um, and then another discussion here, this top right, selection and breeding for disease resistance. So you guys have a lot of crab apples in the Midwest and they all get apple scab. And then we're going out and treating with tons of fungicides, even though it's not typically the direct cause of death. Um, the trees look really bad, they defoliate really early, and repeated early defoliations can reduce the life of the tree and, kill it long term. So there are now a lot of disease resistant cultivars of crab apples that are out there. So that's just one example. But the nurseries have made huge strides as far as um, breeding plants, which is very weird to me as someone who doesn't do that, but also really cool because it just gives you more opportunities and more chance for native species that are going to be appropriate for the space that you have. Modifying the environment. So I love talking about mulch. Um, mulch your trees if you can. Like turf and trees are not happy together from the tree health perspective. Well, either they're not happy together. If you've got a tree that's shading out the turf is going to look sad, and the tree gets sad because it doesn't have mulch. So it alters the conditions for a less favorable environment for pathogens and more favorable to the tree. It keeps soil moisture in, it breaks down slowly over time to provide nutrients for the tree. If there is one thing you can do to a tree that is going to improve it, it's mulch. And I'm like, as someone who actually deals a lot with chemicals, I would probably have 50% less volume of discussion about chemicals if everyone just mulched their trees. Oh, get off my soapbox now. Um, so modifying the environment. So this is an interesting um, thing. So talking about apple scab here, and I don't mean to get too into data or anything, but this is important to note here that the highest amount of infection happens right. You can see average temperatures from 63 to 75 um, degrees. So maybe that's talking about planting in a different temperature, or I think it's on the next slide. Yeah, this is what we're talking about. It thrives with moisture. So if you are watering up and getting all of those leaves wet, or in this case, needles, whatever the circumstance is, you are creating the perfect environment for fungal pathogens to thrive. So soaker hoses that are putting out the correct amount of water in the right place at the right time is going to be huge rather than spraying your entire yard. Plus, you're going to improve where that water is actually going. So instead of just paying water to be absorbed into the air, you're actually going to be paying your water bill to water your plants, but also going to help with the pathogen aspect of things too. As we said, healthy trees are happy trees. So using these cultural methods, root collar excavation is up next. We see that those roots are starting to girdle the base of that tree. Luckily, they are still pretty small, so you actually have the ability to go in and remove some of those before they literally choke the tree to death. So that's a great option. And then kind of along those lines, you would use air spade potentially to deal with the soil management. So you could break up compaction and do the girdling roots all in one swoop with an air tool. And then when it comes to actual soil, doing a soil test, figuring out what nutrients are missing, and then doing some sort of root enhancement. So there's a lot of things out there. So a lot of fertilizers that are out there. And if you guys have questions on that, let me know. But there's kind of there's not a ton of data on fertilizers, but there's better and less better options. And then there are things like biochar that increases root space and organic matter in your soil. And that could be really helpful too if you've got a really compacted soil. And then again, if it actually is found that the soil is deficient in something specific, going in and amending for that. And then we get to preserving natural predators. So this is what I was talking about when I was talking about chemicals. I'm just going to use spider mites as an example. So spider mites can be killed by quite a lot of different products out there. There are kind of broad spectrum insecticides that will kill spider mites, so like a bifenthrin or permethrin type product, but they also kill all of the other beneficial mites versus there are specific miticides that you could spray that only kill those specific mites. So keeping those ideas in mind when you're talking about preserving natural predators when it comes to using chemical controls. And then what I will say is that there are biological controls that are used out there, typically not with regular arborists or regular homeowners, but on a larger scale, like industry folks and extension agencies. Biological control is a viable option in some circumstances. So that is a cool way to bring natural predators into the mix, only safely and carefully, of course. And then this was interesting. One of my coworkers sent this to me, but reaching outside of the box. So Clemson had an issue with boxwood nematodes, and basically they found that growing plants that were not affected by nematodes would reduce nematode populations long term. So like intermixing different things, which logically makes sense, right? So like diversity, but this isn't, I guess this is not something that like naturally comes to mind, but if you can put other stuff in between your marigolds or in between your boxwoods that are not affected by the specific pest that you're worried about, you can get rid of, you can lower those populations over time. All right, and then this is reaching outside the box, and I think we'll be able to take a break right after this. Plant growth regulators, and I only bring this up because with urban environments, these are super cool and can be super useful, but also because I do a ton with plant growth regulators at my job. So obviously I like talking about them. Cambistat is what I use, but it's a paclobutrazole, if you've ever heard of that. But basically, this could be a cool opportunity to prevent pathogens because it has some sort of benefits that thicken leaf cuticles and thicken trichome hairs. And then when you're talking about, like, for instance, like a scab or a rust, it would make it harder for those hyphae of those fungi to set in that leaf. Therefore, the leaf would not even get it. So this is technically a chemical, but it's also not a chemical, right? It's only impacting the biology of the plant, not actually impacting the biology or chemistry of anything else in the environment. So that's a cool opportunity that's sort of outside the box. And there's we did a research project with Dr. Watson at the Morton Arboretum, and that was one of the results that we saw. So this
Stop stepping on my stuff.
This product that was meant to keep a tree smaller also found to have these secondary benefits of keeping that leaf fungus at bay. So that's cool. Hang on one second. So let me get through these like last 2 slides and then we'll take a break. So once monitoring, diagnosis, identification, and action thresholds indicate that pest control is required, IPM programs then evaluate the proper control method for effectiveness and risk. And that's where I will take a break, if that's okay, Al.
It's great timing. We haven't really had a whole lot of questions come in, so I don't know if anybody's been sitting on them or anything's like, wait, or anything. So if there aren't any pressing questions or comments or anything like that, I think we can take a quick 5 minutes. So anybody, throw it in the chat or just unmute yourself. I mean, we've got a pretty small group this evening.
Do either like the city of Chicago for the street trees or the park district, did they ever spray trees or do any kind of use any kind of insecticides, or is it kind of they don't really have the budget, etc.? I mean, I know that for like emerald ash borer and stuff they were, but
yeah, so I have worked on the city of Chicago municipality as well as park district contracts for a couple of things. So in their budgets, they obviously have money, have dealt in the past at least, have had money for emerald ash borer treatments, of course. The other one that they really utilize is for Dutch elm disease treatment. So city of Chicago has, oh gosh, a lot of elms under treatment, especially at Grant Park. I did that contract one summer. So the answer is yes. As far as sprays, not really. And I think that just comes down to like sheer quantity. And also the fact that most of those things are more like aesthetic. So I would guess that there's a few pocket things that they may do sprays for or treatments for, but generally it's only the sort of like big problems that they don't. Basically, it's risk mitigation, because if they had 1,000 elm trees die in one season, they would be so screwed.
Great. Thanks for that question and comment, Ruda. That's a one of our rock solid tree keepers up in Rogers Park, right, Ruda?
Yeah, Rogers Park.
Cool.
Great. I'll tell you what, let's take 5 minutes. I've got 7:03 on my clock, so 7:08, let's be back and ready to see this out. And I encourage more questions and comments as we go along. And we'll see you all in 5 minutes. I'm glad you brought up black knot, Ruda. Oh man.
Yeah, good questions rolling in.
Good Lord. We've got one tree in my neighborhood that's got it really bad. Actually, there were two trees right next to each other, and it's a famous or more like infamous house right along the Kennedy, overlooking the Kennedy where I live. And somebody, I don't know who, they went and pruned one of the cherry trees and then left the other one. And then
Yeah.
I'm starting to see a black knot and some of the other cherry trees in my neighborhood. So gonna get some permits and try to cut that stuff out now. And there's another place where we've done a little bit of pruning, the Montrose Metro Community Garden. Actually, Alison, you might know where that is.
Yeah.
Where I've worked with them to cut out the black knot for some cherries. And you can imagine growing along a metro line, maybe a little bit of a stressful environment for for a tree. And
Yeah.
I'm given like, 12 inches or more of, you know, uh, between the knot and where I'm pruning it and then cleaning after every cut to hopefully not spread it. So what we did about a year ago, those looked better this past winter when we were there. But there's still some of it there, so working on it. And some of the trees just look really stressed out, which of course never helps. So
Yeah, I mean, typically that's why cherry trees succumb to black knot, because they're already stressed to begin with.
Do like the native black cherries, do they get it?
Not as much. It's more the ornamental prunus species.
I know like Westridge Nature Preserve has, like, I haven't seen it on the black cherries, but it's on some of the, I'm not sure what they are, but like some shrubs that are more recently planted.
Yeah, usually those will be like the smaller, like purple leaf plums and stuff that will get it. And I do have to say, I think part of it is because it's typically like younger trees, at least in my experience, that have gotten it. So some of those larger black cherries are like strong and vibrant enough. But that's not to say black knot can impact any prunus species. So that's not to say it can't get it.
I just that's something I learned today from you. Then I didn't know that the native sriracha or the black cherry was more resistant to that. I thought they were all pretty susceptible. So I learned something this evening. Thank you.
I'm just speaking anecdotally because I've seen it on other prunus species and not as much on the Serrana. So I could do a little more digging for you. But anecdotally speaking, I don't know that I've ever seen it on Serrana before. So, but again, like my hunch would be linked to the fact that typically black cherries are the native black cherries are well established and larger in the communities in which we're seeing it. But I'm going to do a little more digging for you, Al.
Right on for all of us. So
Yeah.
is everyone back in back ready for the rest of us? If you just joined us, we were having a discussion about black knot, which is a relatively new, pretty nasty looking from an aesthetic standpoint and also from a health standpoint, fungus, and it pretty much it is exactly what it sounds like. We saw a picture of it earlier in your presentation.
Yep.
It's pretty and it's pretty bad. I think we can attribute it to the wet springs that we keep happening.
Yep.
And it's definitely hitting you will. I've seen it even just biking around Chicago. And tell you what, I think I will stop talking and I will let you kind of take it from there, Allison, and also Ruta's other question. Ruta, thanks for joining this evening. And if other people, again, I encourage questions and comments. Normally, we would like a very a healthy exchange and not say a lecture format, but don't feel shy. If you have questions or comments, please chime in.
Yeah, and they don't even have to be necessarily related to what I'm talking about. If you guys have general pest pathogen questions, let me know. But I'll address these really quick. So the question was, how damaging is black knot to cherry trees? I've been seeing it around lately. Yes, pretty damaging. It is a fungal pathogen, like Al just said. It's definitely exacerbated by our long, wet, cool springs. It's just what it sounds like. It looks like it's got brownish black knots. It's like kind of like poop, sorry for that visual, attached to the twigs of the trees. You have to do pretty serious pruning to get them out, and then in some circumstances, fungicide sprays to get control. Otherwise, it does kill trees relatively quickly. So it's pretty serious and pretty damaging after a few seasons. It's enough to knock out some of those smaller prunus. And then we've got, what are the pros and cons of removing twig galls like oak bullet galls? Since they are native insects, they play a role in the ecosystem and have value there. Yes. So that's why I put twig galls under, remember when I said like friend, foe, or whatever, I put twig galls in the whatever category because They are native insects. They play a role in the ecosystem, and they're not really, when we're talking about that threshold, they're not really causing any problems. Like, yes, there's an aesthetic standpoint concern of it, but typically it's not bothering anyone. There is one circumstance with some of those wasp goals. I know I have been in this circumstance before where I had a really bad infestation and it was like on a playground, and the lady was really, really concerned that if the kids got by, technically they are stinging. So we ended up removing those 2 trees because she was really, really concerned about it, which makes sense, right? But generally speaking, all of those native insects are not going to be problematic to anyone. The galls are simply aesthetic, and I would just leave them alone. Um, but super good question, because actually I get a ton of arborists that call me about that all the time.
I mean, I have seen some like I think there were bur oaks that had them
Yep.
in a Lake County forest preserve, and there were like a few trees that were just really stressed. I mean, there were some young seedlings that looked like maybe they weren't going to make it, and then
Sure.
there was like a large parent tree
Yeah.
right nearby.
To me though, I mean, again, it's aesthetic, and they can contribute to the decline of a tree, but if those trees were decline, typically that's like a secondary thing. So if those trees are gonna die, maybe it speeds it up, but you wouldn't go out, you wouldn't spend your time like pruning that out. You would just wait for the tree to slowly decline and remove it and replace it as needed in that circumstance. Okay, cool. Thank you for the questions. I love talking about that stuff. Super applicable, right? This is why we're here. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about control, the plant healthcare toolbox. Not as applicable to you guys who don't actually do applications, but I do think it's really interesting. And this is like a super important part of our industry, even though you don't think about it. Plant healthcare is actually contributes to probably over 25% of the revenue in the tree care industry in general. So it's like pretty big numbers. And actually, like if you want to talk from a money standpoint, return on plant healthcare treatments is actually really high. So if you're talking, or if you're thinking about becoming an arborist or working for a tree care company, like this is actually where the money is, which sounds weird, but it's important. That's why it's important to you all and this industry as a whole. So we already talked about cultural practices, but then we've got sprays, soil applications, and tree injections in our toolbox. And again, you guys have seen some of this if you've been to anything that I've been involved with, but we'll go in a little bit deeper today. Um, okay, so all right, we did talk about cultural controls. I guess we have a little bit more here. Improve the drainage, move the downspouts, install drainage systems. Again, improving the soil decompaction and fertilizers as needed. We kind of talked about this too, but pruning. So you could remove the pathogen. So there's a perfect circumstance like with our black knot, remove the pathogen. Um, And then manual control. So this one is like a bug barrier. I don't use these a lot. They're not out there a ton, but that could be manual actual removal of the pest. So if you had like a webworm or what am I thinking of? A webworm, something like that, you can literally cut them out. And then these bug barriers exist. So like with spotted lanternfly on the East Coast, they're using these a lot because basically they put a sticky band or a bug barrier around and it prevents it from even going up in the tree. I know they do that with scales and stuff in the Southeast as well. And then biological controls, which again, like arborists don't really use, but some folks in the industry do. We've seen really good results with predator mites. And actually, I was just talking to my friend. They even use these in a household plant circumstances sometimes. I think that's becoming more popular. I personally not ready for that, but it's cool that it exists. And then obviously researchers have done a ton of this around like emerald ash borer, Asian longhorn beetle, stuff like that. So certainly there are options out there, maybe not for us, but in general, industry wide. And then the important thing to note, this picture makes me laugh, the control, managing has unintended consequences. Everything we do has an influence, so you need to make careful choices of chemicals and how you apply them and their modes of action. So, um, managing pesticide resistance, and this is something that we talk about a lot in agriculture, but not as much in arboriculture, but it's still pretty important. So, let's see. All right, we've got first generation before a pesticide application, and then this is what we have left after the pesticide application. And then you've got your later generation, and then after the pesticide application, right? So now you can see we've bred that special red one, right? This happens with resistance always. The special red one that is now resistant to the pesticide. And so now, you've got a bit of an issue. So this can happen if you over or underdose on the active ingredient. If you've got pests that have particularly large broods, that increases the chances of those mutations, or just selectively ending up choosing those special pests. And then this also can happen when you rely exclusively on pesticides, specifically a singular pesticide. So we'll talk about rotation in a second. So this is important, especially on the agriculture side. They talk a lot about the mode of action classification. So we call them FRAC classes. Or this is IRAC classes. But anyway, the mode of action is different for different chemicals. And we typically like to rotate our chemicals using these different modes of action. So specifically, one example that's really tried and true in the tree care industry is fungicide application. So if you're dealing with like a needle cast or a leaf fungus, and it requires, basically what you have to do for those circumstances is you have to do 3 applications of fungicide, timed about 3 to 4 weeks apart, and year after year. So you could imagine if you're using the same thing over and over, those little spores that would be reproducing could potentially become resistant. So what we like to do is rotate the mode of action. Some can be like a blanket cover that kills the fungus right away. Some are like systemic and kill them in a different way, right? So you don't need to get into all of the like who's and what's and whys, but this is something that we do. Agriculture is the one who developed this specifically because they did see a lot of resistance to specific fungicides and insecticides. Thus why we are kind of like in the boat that we are in regards to like whatever, all of the insecticide and pesticide problems that we have in agriculture. Anyway, it has never happened in arboriculture that we have noted, but we're just trying to avoid it. So this is put in the best management practices for all of arboriculture to rotate. Yeah. I'm trying to see. Okay, so this is just really interesting to me, but basically there are different modes of action that can impact different things. So like one type of insecticide could go towards the nerve and muscle way that the bug lives. The other could be for the respiration, and the other could be the growth and development. So different insect growth regulators will work in different ways. Like one will prevent it from doing mitosis, and the other would prevent it from like developing reproductive parts, or whatever. So it's really interesting. We don't need to get into it too deep, but this is something to be mindful of out there. And this is what I was talking about with fungicides specifically, mode of action with fungicides. That was my example last time. And this also goes for fertilization. So this chart is really interesting. You can see the different micronutrients along the top and then the side, and you can see what has an antagonistic and what has a synergistic impact. So you can see like whatever you can do wrong things when you're doing fertilization. So this is why, and again, I'm not going to like go into this chart or what we do really industry wide, but get a soil analysis and use the information that you have to do correct fertilization, because theoretically, looking at this chart, you could produce an antagonistic soil environment, which is not improving anything for anyone. Okay, and then Yeah, just important to note. This always comes up, right? Grow wise, be smart. So just follow your best management practices for bee health in the horticultural industry. Just always being mindful of your bee populations, your bee labels, things like that. If you guys have any specific questions on this, please let me know. But this is also like why I care about what I do. There are a lot of neonics out there that are still kind of necessary in a way for some things. Um, and if you guys have questions, again, let me know. But I am constantly working on, more bee friendly alternatives to be out there to help our industry in general. But I live in Portland, which was the big bee kill. I think that was like 2012, 2013, which caused a ton of label changes within the EPA with neonics, which was not a good way to have that happen, but it did probably for the better. So anyway, always being mindful of that. So we'll get into actual applications, types of applications. So here we've got our foliar sprays. There are some advantages to foliar sprays. Sometimes it's the only choice, unfortunately, but that's cool. It is typically these applications are tried and true. You get good results and they are economical because typically it's not expensive to do a foliar application because at this point, most of the chemicals that are used for foliar sprays have been around for decades and are actually pretty cheap. Disadvantages, obviously, we've got the sort of public perception side of things. Constantly worried about getting good coverage because if you're not getting good coverage, then why the heck are you doing anything? Drift is huge, especially it's almost alarming how much we get away with drift. The labels will even say like as long as it's less than 10 miles an hour, but theoretically, if those droplets are traveling 10 miles, like that's kind of insane to me. So be careful about that. And then obviously you cannot spray large trees. There's going to be a limitation on that. Whether it's just the spray rig that you have doesn't shoot out enough PSI, that's one limitation. But the other limitation is like you just don't want to do it. It's not good for anyone. So the site comes into play. On the left, we've got a site where that would be pretty much ideal, right? You've got a small shrubs that if that was the thing that we needed to do to take care of a problem that we're dealing with on that little hedgerow, no problem. You're not going to get much drift because it's very low, right? It'd be like chest level. You can make sure that it's getting on your target. You can get good coverage. On the right, on the other hand, I cannot tell you how many people would call me and say like, oh, but I really want you to spray this service barrier that I have right here. And it's like, no, like aquatic issues, obviously huge problem. But just any drift in that circumstance, like even if the water wasn't there, there's so many other plants, so many other beneficial ecosystem things happening that you wouldn't want to do that anyway. So for targets, you would want to target your appropriate pests. So pests that are on the outside of the plants, right? Those are the only things that are really going to be targeted by a foliar spray. So like, and it's interesting, you'll notice here some of the pictures that I'm going to just like pop through are going to be repeated because you can do many different types of treatments on many different pests and a lot of it will be site related. So you can use a foliar application on Japanese beetle as well as you've got like a leaf spot here. And Japanese beetle, that's great if it's like a tiny rose bush in your front yard, great, just quick spray, no problem. It's going to be economical, it's going to get your target, you're not going to have overspray, no problem. However, if a Japanese beetle is on a 70-foot linden tree, lindens, you cannot spray a lot of stuff on them because of the flowering capacity. They're one of the most bee happy trees out there. So I'm going to get into that, but just want you to kind of like note that as the pictures pop up. So inappropriate pests would be like a therapeutic treatment for pests, feeding where it's not even going to contact them. So if you're doing a foliar application for a bark beetle, it's not, oh, that's a bad example. Foliar spray for emerald ash borer, that's not going to do anything, right? There, yeah, there's the exact example. Okay, then we've got options for soil injection. So advantages, easy, there's no drift, and it's very low exposure to both the applicator and the environment. Disadvantages really depends on the soil moisture and tree physiology to see how well it will be taken up into the tree. And there are a very limited number of products out there. Really, ones that we use in industry wide, there's a couple of neonics that are applied as soil applied, and I only know, I think we might have we have one non-neonic. So we have a one soil applied acephate out there. So that's like one of our bee friendly options. And we have the only soil applied label for it. So like it's limited when we're talking about soil applications of actual chemicals. Really good advantages in some circumstances, but we're trying to get better at it. I'm also working on research for some soil applied fungicides and things like that, because the less spray we have to do, the happier I would be. But again, it's like been really hard to get the chemistry right, and we've been researching. Many people have been researching these things for a while. So here's a great appropriate site. You could do it either as an injection like that, or you can do a drench. That's where you'd like shovel out the base of the tree and then kind of pour it around. I didn't put a picture in here, but that's okay. And then inappropriate site. So obviously there are label restrictions, and then super dry sites aren't going to take it up, and obviously no standing water. That is a huge no-no. Okay. So when treating trees with chemicals as an arborist, are those chemicals available to the average homeowner? So it depends. Um, Typically, no. So typically, if you have a pesticide applicator's license, you will need that in order to obtain most of the products that actually work to treat most tree things. That being said, there will typically be like a homeowner equivalent that you can get at Home Depot, not for all of it, but for some of it. But the difference is the active ingredient is typically a lot less, therefore a lot less efficacious. I'm specifically thinking like imidacloprid. You can get that as a homeowner, but like the ones that they sell at Home Depot that are easily available to you would not be the same active ingredient that someone that is buying through a distributor for a tree care company would typically get. And then there are definitely chemicals out there that you cannot get as just a homeowner. So it kind of depends. All right. For soil injection, appropriate pests would be most plant damaging arthropods. Again, there's Japanese beetle, right? I can't see this. Oh, yeah. Why am I drawing a blank on this?
Bagworm?
Thank you, bagworms. I don't know why.
So I see a lot of those. I see a lot of those around, and like, how damaging are they?
They can be pretty damaging. So, but they can also be, they're also really easy to control. So bagworms, you can literally just pull them off of the tree or trim them off of your tree, and that will help manage the population. However, if you let them get bad enough, your trees will be completely brown within the matter of a couple of seasons. So, yeah, and Al says Humalana bald cypress. You'll see them a ton on arborvitae. There's a lot of them in Chicagoland. So if you see them, and they're hard because they just look like little pine cones. Like people don't even realize that they're bagworms until their trees are starting to decline. So, but if you pick one off, they literally have like a shiny bug head. Like you can see them. They're like a little larva in there. Spent a lot of time picking those off of trees. And then also,
Are there different types of those? Like, there are different ones that go after different trees, or are they kind of go
not
after?
that not that I'm aware of. I always thought that bagworms were just bagworms, but I guess it's possible that they'd be different species. That being said, the management would be the same regardless, because I believe they're a Lepidoptera, so they would be same. And then also like, okay, you guys are in EAB land where you're really only treating with tree injection. However, there are soil applications that do work for emerald ash borer under lower pressure circumstances. And then again, like I just mentioned, there is nothing labeled for soil applied fungicide. and not many for bacterial diseases as well. There's like a few bactericides that are soil applied, but data is iffy on efficacy. Bark spray, this is a lesser used methodology out there, but it is easy. There's very little drift. Again, it depends on soil moisture and tree physiology. And again, not a lot of products that you can actually do this with. So most appropriate pests would be, okay. Oh, and these pictures, I'm sorry, this picture didn't like pop over, but a lot of different arthropods can be managed this way. And then Phytophthora, there are a few Phytophthora treatments that are just like bark sprays on the actual trunks of the trees that can help. Not appropriate, again, not for funguses or bacterial diseases. And then trunk injection, which is becoming more and more popular in the industry for good reason. Huge advantages, no drift, very low exposure to the applicator and the environment, and the product is directly applied into the tree. Disadvantages, again, is a little bit dependent on soil moisture. So if you're not having good transpiration, then the uptake is going to be not as great. There are not a lot of trunk injected products out there yet, though it is increasing year after year. We're getting a lot more out there that can be used for trunk injection. It takes more time to train people because it actually is, there is quite a bit of science involved with actually making sure you're doing a proper application. And I would argue it also takes longer to do the applications typically. Because you have to like set up your system, put the chemical in, wait for the uptake time, all of that. It's not like super slow. I would say on average for like an ash tree, it probably only takes like 5 to 10 minutes, but it's still 5 to 10 minutes that you're actively sitting there monitoring your tree versus like a spray. You just like run in, spray it, and get out of there. And then the other thing to always know is that trunk wounding does occur. You are drilling into the tree, which is not a bad thing. There are a ton of, in my opinion, the advantages to trunk injection most of the time outweigh the other options out there if there is an option that exists. But anytime you drill into a tree, you are wounding the tree. You are forcing that tree to undergo stress in order to compartmentalize that wound. And we have come a long way with this. So our injection equipment nowadays is actually pretty small injection sites and built in a way that they can heal rather quickly. 10 years ago, when I first started in the field, you had to use really big drill bits. You had the only thing that was out there was tapping these huge pieces of plastic into the trunk of the tree. It took forever for them to heal. It was really difficult to get them set. Anyway, so we've come a long way and it's better nowadays. However, you're still wounding your tree. So like typical general rule of thumb, we only would like to inject a tree every other year so we can give it time to heal. So in some circumstances, if you had to inject every year, it might not be the best answer for control. Ruta says, with trunk injection, how does the chemical make its way through the tree? Yeah, so you inject directly into the vascular tissue of the tree. And then you just rely on the natural transpiration of the tree to take that up into the xylem, travels up to the top. It can make its way from the base of the tree to the tips of the leaves within a matter of minutes, hours. But yeah, you're putting that right into the vascular tissue of the tree. So you're relying on that tree to take it up completely on its own. And then that's also where the training comes in, because you need to make sure they're setting things properly, right? Because if you drill it too deep, then you'd only be injecting into the heartwood. If you're not drilling it deep enough, then it might spray back at you. So just interesting things to consider, but a really, really cool tool that we've made a ton of headway with. So there is an example of an appropriate site. And I don't know what is going on here. This is super, but you wouldn't want to inject into a tree that has any compromised vascular tissue above where you're injecting, because essentially you would drill into the bottom, it would get taken up into that and then stop, right? If it can't go further, it can't go further. So I think that was the purpose of that. Appropriate pests, a ton of different arthropods, fungal and bacterial wilt disease. So oak wilt, Dutch elm disease, two really awesome solution. We have solutions for those fungal wilts as well as xylella. So that's cool because there aren't other solutions for those besides trunk injection. There are some fungal canker diseases that can be treated with trunk injection, and then micronutrients, that's cool too. So if you have deemed that your tree is deficient in manganese or iron, you can inject those straight into the trunk of the tree and get those turned around pretty quickly, which is awesome that those things exist. Oh, so this is a picture of Dutch elm disease, oak wilt. And then trunk injection is not appropriate for leaf diseases because we have found that the product doesn't make it up into the leaves, or at least it makes it into the leaves, but doesn't have a good enough residual for it actually to make a difference. So we have a question. Are bagworms and pagoda moth the same thing? Pagoda moth, bagworm. Yeah, so anything in the Psychidae family, I think, are technically bagworms. And they're all Lepidoptera, like I was saying. So yeah, I'm going to say yes. The same. Okay, so what time are we at? Perfect. Conclusion. IPM, Integrated Pest Management, is part of plant healthcare. You got to establish those action thresholds. That's the important part of appropriate response. Knowing the plant and the pest will always help us to choose the best control strategy. So diagnostics 100% of the way is going to be a key here. And that's all I have for you. Hang on, I have some questions coming in through the chat. Cool. So if anyone has any questions, let me know, or forever hold your peace. Actually, not really, because my contact information is there. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Great. Yeah, again, any last questions, comments, get them in. Otherwise, let's give Alison a virtual round of applause for a great presentation. Thank you for taking the time. And I keep waiting for like more questions or.
Okay, we have a smaller and shyer group tonight.
Yes. Well, this was fantastic. I really appreciate it, especially you're operating 2 time zones away. But maybe you just can't leave Chicago, even if you don't live here. You have to maintain a
Yeah,
connection.
no, I appreciate you having me. And it's funny. I was just talking to my coworkers. They're like, why are you doing a presentation for Chicago? And I'm like, because we don't have anyone there covering for me yet. But also, like, this is what I know. And then the other comical thing is, like, I spent a decade working on emerald ash borer stuff. And now I'm out here and I was like, oh, it's going to be new pests, but I'm working on emerald ash borer stuff here. So.
Well, great. Everybody, look to Service for some other events we have. I'm really excited about the iTree presentation. I've been working on that for a couple of months. I'm not actually giving it, mind you. I will be learning alongside with you. And the presentation about the survey of tree keepers, again, is Friday, February 5th at 11 a.m. and that will be great. Actually, I've seen it already, so I know it's great. And thank you everybody for your time. Thanks again, Alison. Again, once we get this posted to YouTube, I will share this recording out, and so we'll have that. You'll be able to go back and watch it. And you all know how to get a hold of me if you've got follow-up. And I'm ready to just stop talking. So if anybody's got anything for me, let me know. Otherwise, I will go ahead and wrap this up. Have a great evening, everybody. Happy post-inauguration day. Happy New Year. I'm just going to keep saying it. And we'll see you all before too long. Good to see you, Ruda. We will be in touch for sure. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. This was fun. Thanks, Al.
Right on.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everybody. And I'll wrap this up now.